Heavy footsteps split the air, breaking the silence of midnight. Suddenly they were stilled. A hollow sound of knocking could be heard from the street. The large wooden door squeaked open. Light from within cast eerie shadows around the gaunt stranger who stood there. Before the frightened maid could ask what he wanted, he began. "Tell Lady Pica," spoke the deep, steady voice, "that unless she leaves the house and goes into the stable, the child cannot be born." He turned and disappeared as abruptly as he had come. Strange, wasn't it, the maid thought as she ran to tell the other attendants what had happened. They decided that the strange pilgrim must have been sent by God. They busily removed the woman from her plush room and made her comfortable amid blankets and straw in the stable. Even more unusual, she was quite contented to be there. The rays of a lone candle danced on the stable walls. There was silence, and the cries of a healthy, new baby relieved the tension of all. "It's born. It's born," a maid shouted through the mansion halls. "Come and see Lady Pica's baby." The entire household, servants and maids, clustered around. "Kind of reminds you of Bethlehem and the Christ child," spoke an old gentleman, removing his woolen cap. Everyone wondered about the whys of it all. And they wondered about something else, too. The baby's father was due home from his trip. What would he say? Oh, one of the servants groaned, "He'll never go for the stable part. Don't think the man's got an ounce of common blood in him." Pietro Bernardone scooped the child into his arms. He whirled around to the household staff and bellowed, "My son will be a fine merchant. Never mention the stable again. Do you hear?" They all mumbled, "Yes." But what if God's plans were different? The baby was baptized John. Lady Pica chose the name. His father was furious.
"John? Like John the Baptist in camel skins? Absolutely not. I am his father, and I say he will be called Francis after the refined and cultured French. I want him to have the best the world can offer. I want him to be the best."
"That he will," whispered the elderly maid as she overheard his ranting. "Yes, he will be the best, the kind of best that comes not from earth but from God." Assisi is a small town in north-central Italy, typically Italian. White alabaster houses glow in the bright sun. Steps go up and down, winding around the houses and stores of the town. The majestic Alps usurp all attention as they pretend to touch the sky. Summers see colorful flowers. Beautiful Assisi, where all nature seems to sing the praises of God. An energetic teenager was walking nonchalantly through the narrow streets, smiling as usual, greeting everyone on the way. "Here comes Francis," an old washerwoman laughed as she looked toward the sky and shook her head. "Hello, Signora." Francis tipped his bright red hat. "Where are you off to now, boy?" she asked. "Nowhere special, just out to have some fun," he quipped with a twinkle in his eye. He began to sing a little ditty in French at the top of his lungs as he continued down the street. Actually, Italian was the language spoken in Assisi, but whenever Francis was particularly happy, which was almost always, he sang in French. His dance like steps came to halt before the decrepit old church. Tipping his hat again, he whispered politely, "Hello, my lord." Francis' thoughts turned to the Holy Eucharist all alone inside. Staring at the dusty steps, he put his hands in his pockets and walked a few steps farther. Look at those beautiful mountains in the distance. Nature in full bloom. His thoughts were racing ahead. God made everything so beautiful for man. He stopped, turned around, and eyed once again that dusty old church. "Ah," he whispered, "man doesn't take half as much care of his creator as his creator does." Just then a mischievous little field mouse crossed his path. In a minute Francis was trying to catch him. All his deep thoughts were gone. The times, unfortunately, were not even half as beautiful as the town of Assisi. It was the late 12th century, the days of gallant knights and chivalry, times of parties and of fun. Following the crowd was in fashion, but the crowd wasn't always going in the right direction. The 10 Commandments, God's law, were considered 10 big obstacles to their fun. Life's real purpose of knowing, loving, and serving God was often forgotten in all the noise. Jesus told a story in the Gospel about a man who had followed this same path. He had worked a long time to provide himself with many comforts of life, but had not figured God into the plan. He reassured himself, "Relax, my soul, eat, drink, and be merry. You have a long time to enjoy your wealth." That very night he died. God called him to give an account of his life. He went to the judgment seat alone, leaving all his money, his luxuries behind. Jesus asked, "Whose are they now?" Only his good deeds were able to help him, but they were so few. Diamond dash-shaped patches. Francis was a son of his times, but money meant nothing to him. Maybe that's why he spent it so fast. The bolts of material in his father's shop were disappearing too. He was giving them away. If ever the world had an optimist, the son of Pietro Bernardone was one. Generous Francis was the most popular young man in town. "Hey Francis," a group of his companions tapped on the window of the Bernardone shop. "See you tonight." "Meet you at 9, Francis laughed back. At 9 sharp, he appeared on the doorstep, and what an appearance. The tips of his smile almost touched his ears. His dark eyes were talking fun, but this was usual. Tonight, however, he had added something red, orange, purple, green, yellow, all diamond-shaped patches of color sewn into a clown suit that Francis had made especially for these nights. He was like a king among his friends. He knew it ... and he enjoyed it too.
Not a few times the neighbors had to lose sleep as Francis and company would holler and sing marching through the streets at midnight. "Your Francis is hopeless," the neighbors would complain to Lady Pica. You'd think.
He was the son of a millionaire, the way he acts. Instead, he is only the son of a merchant. Lady Pica would lower her eyes and answer, "Yes, he is a merchant's son, but I pray that someday he will be God's son too." One day a beggar approached Francis when he was very busy in the shop. "For the love of God, please give me something." "Can't you see I'm busy?" Francis snapped impatiently. "Go away." The old man walked quietly away. Francis reflected, "Look what I did. If a friend of mine or a rich man had sent him, I would have received him willingly. Here he came and asked me alms for the love of God, and I refused. Yet who is a greater or better friend than God?" Almost before he finished the thought, he dropped the bolt of cloth on the counter, left the customers standing there unattended, and ran after the poor beggar, emptying all the money from his pockets into the old man's hands. The least of his brethren, Francis whispered to himself as he returned to his work. "What I do for the least of the brethren is done for Christ." Francis often wondered about his future. "I could take up my father's cloth trade, but that's not for me. I want to become something great." Like he paused a few moments. Like a knight, a famous soldier, his chance came soon enough when Assisi went to battle with a neighboring city. Francis, full of enthusiasm, joined the squabble. Hardly had he donned his uniform when the Assisian men at war were taken prisoner. Discouragement gripped all of the defeated army, all except Francis. "Look at that kid," one of the prisoners grumbled. "Here we are in this dumpy cell, half-starved, and he's cracking jokes." Another made a poor attempt to come to his defense. "Probably the guy's crazy. No one in his right mind would be happy here, and in this condition." But Francis didn't care what anyone said. He really was happy. "Here we are in prison," he would say. "Oh well, it could be worse." His optimism was catchy. It rubbed off on the other men, and before their release a year later, they had all become great friends. Prison hadn't shattered Francis' spirits, but his physical strength was broken. High fever racked his body, and the townsfolk whispered nervously, "The doctor thinks he is going to die." Lady Pica never left his bedside. How she prayed that God would spare her son, and God heard her prayer. The fever broke, and little by little, new strength surged into the boy's body. One morning his mother came in smiling, "Good news, Francis, you can get out of bed today." He sat up straight. It had been such a long time.
"And it's a great day," he exclaimed, trying to muster up all his old enthusiasm. "Let me see my town again." He slipped out of bed, but before he even made it to the window, his knees started shaking. Lady Pica caught him just in time.
"What happened?" he asked a little nervously as his mother helped him into the chair. "Don't try to do everything all at once," she whispered. "You've been sick a long time." Soon Francis managed to get around with a cane. The first day that he felt strong enough, he attempted a walk through the village. Everyone was happy to see him. Well, if it isn't Francis. Thank God you're back on your feet, boy. Good to see you, son. Congratulations, Francis. Keep it up. He tipped his hat, smiling to each as he passed by. But actually, Francis didn't feel like smiling. In fact, the more he looked at the ugly cane that held him up, the more he wondered if he would ever be completely well again. Looking at the distant mountains, his thoughts wandered. I used to run to the foot of those beautiful hills, now I can hardly walk. What fun I had with my friends singing in the streets, now I have to use so much energy just to breathe the words the old parish priest uttered on Ash Wednesday seemed to hit him in the face. Remember, man, you are dust and unto dust you will return. What use is it to put so much importance in the joys this world offers when they slip through our fingers like smoke rings? We are made for God, for eternal life. Maybe it is better to put our treasure in heaven, never to be destroyed, never to be stolen, than to place our hopes in this world where nothing lasts forever. Making his way back to the house, he tried to send away the sudden meditation. It was far too serious thinking for such a happy day.
I'll be well soon and back to the old fun, he tried to tell himself, but it wasn't working. This time he could not forget the choice that so clearly faced him, God or the world.
As the months passed, Pietro di Bernardone watched his once happy-go-lucky boy become quiet and disinterested. He was worried. Francis, son, you act like you've lost your best friend. No, I just... Well, Francis stuttered, I have to do something with my life. What do you want? Pietro tried to come up with a solution. He snapped his fingers and yelled with delight. I'll send you to school. You can have the best education for any profession. You can have anything this old man can afford to buy. Francis put his head up. Maybe it is worth a try. I feel healthy enough and have the money, the time. Stop talking riddles, Pietro interrupted. What will it be? Embarrassed by his thinking aloud, Francis piped up. Oh yes, I have decided already. I'll be a knight. Again, Pietro tried to choke down a laugh. He didn't want to discourage his son. After all, at least he was interested in something again. Pietro bought the armor and the horse. When the big day came, all the townsfolk were there to wish Francis success in his new military career. All cheered him as he rode off. Pietro was proudest of all. First, the man said softly as he stroked his short, pointed beard, "My son shall be first." Night came. Sleep caught Francis as soon as he closed his eyes. He began to dream. Someone was speaking to him. Francis called a mysterious voice. Is it better to serve the master or the servant?
Master, he said, fumbling for the words.
Then why do you make the servant a master? Those words opened wide the doors of Francis' conscience. He saw himself as he really was, so small, so poor by God's standards.
My lord, what must I do? He managed to ask.
Return to Assisi, and you will be told. The would-be soldier awoke, sat up in the bunk, and spent the rest of the night thinking. He stared at the ceiling, then the wall. His imagination relived the dream again and again. God, he murmured, the master alone deserves my life. He must be my king. The first will be his knight. God, only God. God, only God. When dawn carried the first rays of sunshine into the dingy barracks, Francis was already out of bed. If God wanted him to return to Assisi, then he would do just that, and as fast as he could, he mounted his horse, still equipped with all the swords and armor for war. As he rode away, the metal pieces of armor clanked against the swords. They all seemed so foolish to him now. Perhaps the situation reminded him of the words of Saint Paul that called all great deeds and worldly honors nothing but tinkling brass and clanging cymbals without love for God and fellow man. Pietro di Bernardone, who had proudly bragged about his son a few days before, was utterly humiliated to see Francis home so soon. But the boy's old friends brushed the incident off as another of Francis' whims. They were happy to have their king back and invited him to a big party. Francis went, or at least he started to go. He was at the head of the crowd as usual, but this time he was quiet. A few yards down the road, he was in the middle of the crowd. A few yards further, He was straggling at the end, until he was alone. The noisy group was moving farther and farther ahead. Francis began to pray, unaware of time, or place, or people. Some of his friends noticed his absence and came back to find him. He didn't even realize they were around him until one poked his shoulder. "Hey Francis, Simon, what's the matter with you?" I know another teased, "Okay Francis, who is she?" He in love. "Yes, I am in love," Francis said with determination, "and the secret is mine to keep. Hope it works out as well as your night." Hoodventure, they laughed, but Francis didn't think anything was funny. His face flushed with anger, and without further words, he walked away, leaving his friends behind, totally baffled.
He wasn't angry at the other young men. He was angry with himself at all the time he had wasted with the wine-happy group behind him. Francis was humbled. He turned to God, his newfound love, and prayed. He really prayed.
The village church of St. Damien and a dingy cave became a second home to Francis. He went there to pray for hours. His goal in life had changed. Now he sought only God, but the boy was still himself, generous and cheerful. One day he was preparing everything for a lavish dinner. His mother asked, "What are all these fine linens, dishes, and preparations for?" "A party with your friends." "Yes, I invited all my new friends, and we're going to have a party tonight." "Your new friends?" his mother asked inquisitively. "My very dear friends," to Francis added. That night, Lady Pica peeked in on the party. Imagine her surprise when she saw all the poor, the beggars and unfortunates of Assisi dining at a banquet with her son. Francis had always loved everyone. Now he was aiming to perfect that love. He wanted to love them regardless if they were rich or poor, kind or cruel, because he saw in them Christ, the Savior of all men, and God gave him the chance to prove it. One afternoon he was riding his horse through town. All of a sudden the horse jolted. Francis looked to see what had happened. There to the side was a leper sitting on the ground. Leprosy is a disease that causes body decay. In those days, it meant slow and certain death. Everyone was afraid to go near the lepers because the disease was highly contagious. From a distance, Francis took a few coins from his pocket. Just as he was about to toss them to the leper, he reflected that poor man is loved by God, too. He is my brother because we are all children of God. Gripping the saddle of his horse, he dismounted and walked toward the leper. His legs didn't seem to want to carry him any closer. His stomach was turning weak. He swallowed hard. With every step, the sickening odor of rotting flesh became stronger. "I must keep going," Francis insisted to himself. "I have to show God I want to love him without limits." With all his heart, he took the last step. The leper didn't quite know what to make of this rich, healthy young man who was actually coming near him. His sore, red eyes opened even wider when Francis pressed the coins into the palm of his hand and kissed him, putting his arm around the leper's shoulder, as though they were great friends. The poor leper just sat there stunned, staring at the coins in his hand. He looked up with tears in his eyes to see his kind benefactor, but Francis was already on his way down the road with a joy in his heart, so great that he thought it would burst. He whispered, "For Christ, my God, my brother. My God, what have you chosen for me? I'm ready, tell me your holy will." Francis prayed with all his heart before the dusty crucifix in St. Damien's. A voice seemed to penetrate the silence. "Francis, Francis," he knelt motionless. Was Christ speaking to him? It was a voice deep within his soul. His eyes pierced the crucifix. He listened. "Francis, go build up my church." At last he had a specific mission to accomplish, and there would be no half measures for this king. The youth scanned the cracked walls of St. Damien's and noticed the gaping holes in the roof. He headed straight for his father's store. Minutes later, all the finest materials from the Orient were off the shelves, mounted on horseback, and on the way to market with Francis. Late that night, the young merchant, he returned in triumph to Assisi, singing in French. Not a single yard of material was left, and he was on foot. He had sold his horse, too. The next day, Francis returned to St. Damiens to have a talk with the old priest who was sitting at the door. "Father, here it is. All the money you need to fix the church," he exclaimed, holding the bag of money in front of the priest. Father raised his eyebrows. "Where did you get that?"
"I sold some material," came the reply. "You sold quite a lot of material if you ask me, and your father couldn't know because he isn't even home." "Sorry, Francis, I know you too well. And I know your father too."
"But I'm my father's son, I work for him. This is only my share. Take the money. It's for the church," Francis pleaded. The old priest said no more. He just shook his head no. Francis looked at the priest. He looked at the decrepit church, and then at the unwanted gift in the bag dangling from his hand. Shrugging his shoulders, he walked away. After he had taken a few steps, the boy looked back, thinking father had reconsidered, only to see him still shaking his head. "It's for the church," Francis muttered to himself. "And it's only my share." He bounced the bag up and down in his hands and turned with determined steps toward home. But he just couldn't do it. Why should he take the money back home? It was meant for God. He returned, flung the sack on the priest's windowsill, and muttered, just in case he changes his mind. He put his hands in his pockets and left. It was time for a spontaneous song. Of course, it was in French. The first thing Pietro noticed when he returned home was the empty space on the shelf. Francis was missing too. Knowing the generosity of his son, it didn't take him long to put two and two together. "Where is he?" Pietro ranted. "Where is he?"
Lady Pica fluttered about, trying to calm him down. "It can't be that bad, dear."
"It is that bad. And I know where he is, too," he hollered, slamming the door behind him. The priest at St. Damien saw Pietro storming toward the church. He had been expecting this. Looks hot enough to set the place on fire, he thought. Father tried to handle the situation diplomatically. "Hello, Pietro, how are you?" he asked with a nervous smile. "Where is he?" Pietro demanded.
Who the old priest asked, "Do you mean Francis? The unwanted gift?"
"Yes," the merchant answered in a flat tone. "I want my boy and I want my money." "Oh, yes, well, the money is all here." The pastor reached for a little bag hidden carefully behind the door. He tossed it to Signor di Bernardone. "He means well," the priest managed to say. Pietro cut him off. "Never mind. Keep your explanations to yourself."
Later in the day, Francis slipped into St. Damien's. The priest recounted the morning's incident. Francis listened and lowered his head. "But Dad has so much ... and sometimes we give God so very little."
"Yes," Francis' father put his hand on his shoulder. "When you plant your treasures on this earth, that is where your heart is, too. Heavenly treasures are much harder to understand, but when a man finds that single pearl of it, great price, he sells all that he has to buy the pearl of great price ... and his heaven. This would be the quest that would mold a merchant's carefree son into a saint the world would never forget. Look, a crazy man," the children mocked a gaunt-looking man who was sitting by the side of the street. Townsfolk peered through their shop windows to see what all the commotion was about. To most, the man appeared to be just another beggar. But one elderly townsman who had gotten a closer look wasn't as convinced. He stood on the sidewalk scratching his head, and each stroke of his fingers through his thin white hair seemed to bring him closer to a conclusion. "Looks like the fellow hasn't slept for at least a week ... Pale face, black eyes, underweight ... But if it's anybody else except Francis Bernardone, I'll eat my hat in a flash." The news spread from shop to shop. Francis. Mouths dropped in mute amazement. Finally, the word reached Pietro di Bernardone, "A crazy man, my Francis." That did it. Pietro pushed his way through the crowd of children. He grabbed his son by the arm and shook him until he rattled. He dragged him home and threw him into the cellar. Stay there, Pietro screamed with the little voice he had left, "and bread and water is all you'll eat." He slammed the cellar door.
"That will break him," the bewildered man said to himself. "All this nonsense about fasting, praying and strengthening his spirit, I can't believe it. Either he's crazy or I am." He began to smile a little. The cellar will do him good.
One afternoon, the cellar door opened. Francis squinted into the light streaming down the rickety stairs. He had a visitor. Lady Pica hurried toward him with a complete hot meal. Her visit meant that Pietro was away. "Francis dear, look, your favorite dinner.oh." Mother Francis gulped. "Be careful if he sees you." "No, your father won't see me. He's not at home. This foolishness has gone on long enough. But it's only because Dad doesn't understand about your prayers and penances." She paused. "Maybe you could compromise a little? Just go to a few parties, son, and get interested in the store again." Francis smiled at his mother. Then his face grew serious. "My way now is to follow Christ, Mother. Peace is never found in compromise with the world." The woman had no answer. Her son was right. "Well, eat something, dear. You must be hungry." Francis looked at the luxurious dinner prepared for him. He picked up the bread, dipped it in water, and sprinkled it with ashes from the floor. Lady Pica gasped. "But what are you doing?" Francis' pale face flushed red. He had become so used to this penance that he did it, forgetting the presence of his mother. "Little sacrifices," he explained, "help us grow strong in the love of Christ. Brother Ashes helps keep my mind and body strong and pure." Lady Pica could see that Francis was a changed man. He, who had been the worldly son of a merchant, now was becoming that son of God whom she had prayed for. Her throat tightened, her eyes filled with tears, but she did not want to be less brave than he. Holding Francis' hands in her own, she whispered, "No one else is home. Leave while you have the chance. Follow the path God has chosen for you and know that your mother follows you with her heart wherever you go." He didn't have to say anything. His eyes told her the whole story. He kissed her gently on the forehead and left. The cell was empty. Pietro's plan had failed. But all was not finished. If Francis would not comply with Pietro's expectation of his son, then he would disown him. He turned the matter over to his lawyers, who summoned Francis to civil court. There he would be publicly disinherited from the entire Bernardone estate. Francis did not comply with the summons at first, because he felt that he was under the jurisdiction of the church. Pietro quickly took the whole matter directly to the bishop. Soon thereafter, father and son met before the bishop. Francis was on one side of the table, Pietro on the other. An audience of priests and laity had gathered in the back. Pietro spoke. "Your Excellency, the shameful conduct of this young man has disgraced our name. From this day on, I no longer consider him my son and demand that he return anything he has gotten from me." Francis arose and removed a small bag of coins from his belt. The courtroom was stilled. The silence could almost be heard. What was Francis doing? He placed the coins on the table and, to the surprise of all, removed the clothes he wore and placed them in front of his father. "Here is everything, Dad. All that you have given me, I return. Until today I have called Pietro Bernardone my father, but now in all truth I shall say only, Our Father who art in heaven." Many in the courtroom cried. The bishop too was moved. All were deeply impressed, except poor Pietro. His eyes were on fire as his hands tightened their grip on the table. He could see his son only as a rebel, and perhaps he was partly right. Francis was a rebel, but not in the way Pietro thought. His rebellion was against the mediocrity of the world, and his all-powerful tool would be total, self-sacrificing love and dedication to Christ and his church. Pietro scooped up the clothes and the money and left. But his son's prayers would follow him, and someday he would understand. The bishop put his hand on Francis' shoulder, spreading his own cloak around him. The last thread tying him to the world was cut. Francis was free at last. But the freedom he had won was not something selfish and private. He wanted to give everything he had to God and to help his fellow man too. He looked at the world around him. Things certainly were not what they should be. But he wasn't about to step out of line and point his finger in accusation. He wanted to build a world of goodness with the help of God and the approval of the one man who was Christ on earth, the Pope. Now Francis understood those commanding words, "Build my church." It had little to do with the crumbling walls of St. Damian's. His call was to help build Christ's mystical body, to build the Roman Catholic Church. A staggering task for one little man. But one little man with God would do great things. Francis walked slowly out of the court room. He felt stronger, almost joyful, because this day marked the beginning of a new life. He would pray hard to know the way to follow in the footsteps of the Master. Herald of the King. Who goes there? The rushes along the side of the lonely road came alive as a band of robbers jumped out from behind them. "Halt!" they shouted, pointing swords at Francis, who was passing through the mountain en route to Gubbio. "Who are you?" the leader demanded. "I am the herald of the King," Francis responded calmly. "May I be of some service?" The robbers exchanged sly glances and snickered at the funny-looking man. Indeed, the whole situation was a little funny. There stood Francis dressed in a shabby gardener's cloak. His hair was disheveled, and he was without shoes. "Herald of the King, eh? What king would claim you?" The robbers laughed aloud at the pathetic-looking young pauper. The leader motioned a signal, and 4 of the bandits stepped toward Francis. Each grasped Francis' legs and arms and tossed him high into a snowbank. As they left in search of more prosperous clients, one of the men shouted, "Keep cool, Herald." Francis pulled himself up out of the snow and rubbed his aching limbs. He continued down the road singing until the monastery of St. Benedict came into view. There he remained for a few weeks. On his departure, he continued on to Gubbio, where a friend gave him a monk's habit, shoes, and a staff. Francis spent every spare moment serving the lepers in the nearby hospital. Then, it was back to Assisi, to the Church of Saint Damien. "I don't have the money to have someone build a new Church of Saint Damien," Francis said thoughtfully, rubbing his chin, "but who says I can't build it myself? Now, next problem, where can I get the mortar and bricks? Well, if God wants a new church, he will have to provide bricks. Bricks. For the love of God," Francis called out as he walked the main streets of the town. "Whoever gives me a brick will have a reward from God. Whoever gives me 2 bricks will have 2 rewards from God." There was no doubt that Francis had always possessed a strong pair of lungs, and once again he put them to good use. The young man became quite an attraction, piling bricks, mixing cement with almost as much sweat as water, and to think that he kept singing all the while. Passers-by who stopped to admire the work received a kind invitation to help. Others were a lit. "Wasp or a lit? Ask Francis if he will sell you $1 worth of sweat," one boy remarked to another. Overhearing, Francis answered cheerfully, "I've already sold it at a good price to my king." As the old pastor watched the bricks slowly turn into a new church, he couldn't do enough to show Francis his gratitude. "Anything you need, son. Whatever you want." Francis appreciated the concern, but shied away from all temporal rewards. "I seek no thanks from men, Father," he said simply. "It's the least I can do for my king." The work at St. Damien's was finished. Francis left enough oil to keep the lamp always burning before the Blessed Sacrament. From there he went to restore the Church of St. Peter not too far away. The Chapel of St. Mary of the Angels was the next site for Francis. In no time, it was restored to its former beauty. One morning on the feast of St. Matthew, apostle and evangelist, Mass began as usual in the chapel. The Gospel of the day was taken from St. Matthew. The priest read clearly and slowly, "Jesus sent these men on mission, after giving them the following instructions. As you go, make this announcement: the reign of God is at hand. Cure the sick, raise the dead, heal the leprous, expel demons. The gift you have received, give as a gift. Provide yourselves with neither gold nor silver, nor copper in your belts, no traveling bag, no change of shirt, no sandals, no walking staff. The workman, after all, is worth his keep. Look for a worthy person in every town or village you come to and stay with him until you leave. As you enter his home, bless it. If the home is deserving, your blessing will descend on it. If it is not, Your blessing will return to you." Somehow the gospel of that morning was most meaningful for Francis. He was sure that God spoke especially to him through the inspired words of Matthew. As soon as Mass was over, he asked the priest to explain the gospel word by word. "There must be no compromises with God," Father said. "His servant must be poor in spirit and possessions. His mission is apostolic, which means he must preach the good news of the gospel to all men and diligently live it himself." Francis felt God was showing him another step. "This is what I want. With all my heart, this is what I will follow." Father was impressed by his sincerity and gave the fervent young man his blessing. He exchanged his habit for a brown, cassock-type dress worn by peasants, his leather belt, for a rope. He removed his shoes and staff and walked from town to town, preaching Christ. Thus Francis, the church builder, God's herald, became an apostle. What if this is just one of his fads, one of the many he is noted for? Bernard of Quintaval sat down to think. He planted his elbows squarely on the table and rubbed his temples with his hands. Crowds flocked to hear Francis, and many were being drawn closer to God by his good example. Other young men who had watched him change from a happy-go-lucky party maker to a man of God were particularly interested in what he had to say. And just think, fun-loving Francis was persevering in his austere religious life. This fact alone was cause for reflection. The humble evangelist was no match for any polished speaker, but something else was attracting the people. There was a mystery about him that some called madness. His peaceful face seemed to contradict the piercing fire and fervor that gushed from his soul. His dark eyes penetrated the hearts of all who beheld him. "The Lord give you peace," was his greeting. His burning desire was to share this grace and peace of Christ with the world, to love him and make him loved. "Build my church," Christ had said. He meant, build my church in men's hearts too. As Bernard continued in his thoughts, a bad tree doesn't bear good fruit. Maybe he is on the right road, he wondered. Could it be that God is calling me to the same life? The young nobleman prayed for guidance. Francis' way of life could truly be found in the gospel, but before he could take any decisive step, he had to be sure. Suddenly an idea formed in Bernard's mind. Snapping his fingers triumphantly, he exclaimed, "I've got it. This will prove his worth." The next time Bernard saw Francis, he put his plan to work. "Do you think I could have the honor of your company at my house tonight?" Bernard asked. Francis gladly accepted. That night, the two men talked until it was very late. When they went to bed, both of them fell fast asleep. At least, it looked that way. Francis opened one eye, then the other, and saw Bernard sleeping soundly. Slowly, quietly, he slipped out of bed, and Francis continued to pray all night long. Began to pray. He continued to pray all night long. Just before daylight, he went back to bed, totally unaware that Bernard had slept either. He had watched every move Francis made through the corner of his eye. This convinced Bernard that his friend was sincere, and now he was determined to follow him. Slowly and thoughtfully he spoke. "Brother Francis, if a man received many goods from his master and then decided he did not want them, what would he do?" "Give them back," was the quick reply. "Brother Francis, I want to return to God. All the earthly possessions he gave me. What should I do?" Francis thought for a moment, then patting Bernard on the back with a gentle hand, he responded, "Tomorrow we will go to church together and pray for the answer to your question." Before that tomorrow arrived, a brilliant lawyer, Peter Catani, joined the two men, and the following day found all three before the altar of the Blessed Sacrament at St. Damien's. Francis approached the altar and opened a large missal which contained all four Gospels. He read the first passage he found. It was Jesus speaking to the apostles. "If you will be perfect, go sell what you have and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven." He opened the book a second time and once again read the first passage he found. "If any man will come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me." And a third time, "And he commanded them that they should take nothing on the way." "Brothers," continued Francis, "this is our rule. and of all who wish to follow. Go and do as you have heard." As soon as they left the church, Bernard and Peter gave all their possessions to the poor, and together they went to St. Mary's Chapel, where they made their first home, a small clay hut. Father Francis, as the brothers now called him, was their superior and father. Thus the Order of St. Francis, its members known for centuries as the Franciscans, was born. I saw it with my own eyes, right there on the church steps. Bernard and Peter gave away all they owned. The gossip buzzed loudly over the crackling fire in the square. When Francis had left everything to follow Christ, he had been the object of conversation and amazement for weeks. Now, 2 prominent citizens had imitated him. What was it all about? "That's nothing," another piped up. "I even heard that they are living in huts near St. Mary's Chapel." Heads were shaking back and forth. There was silence for a time. Then one elderly woman spoke out. "I was there some 25 years ago when Francis was born. A stranger told Lady Pica to go to the stable. It was like the first Christmas in Bethlehem. I knew from that day on that God had special plans for that child. Maybe those men aren't as crazy as you think." Her audience wasn't easily convinced. "No house, no food, no money, and you say they aren't crazy." The old woman stood her ground. "But they have much peace and joy, and a life rich in the blessings of God. Yes, I say they possess a wisdom which is far more than many." In the background, a silent listener took careful note of the whole conversation. The old woman made sense. Francis made sense. After a restless night, this same young man went in search of Francis. Approaching St. Mary's, he saw in the distance a familiar, brown-clad figure. "Brother Francis," he called, running like a child. Francis turned and saw the youth coming down the old dirt road, tripping and stumbling in his excitement. "Father Francis," he stopped a minute to catch his breath. "My name My name is Giles. With all my heart I want to serve God. Please let me be one of your brothers." The kindly brother was moved by the youth's simplicity and sincerity. "God has been very good to you, my brother. Let's say a prayer of thanks together." Francis and Giles returned to the hut, where the brothers were busy with chores. "Brother Bernard, Brother Peter, come. I have good news." Francis was standing in the doorway, smiling. "What, Father Francis?" they questioned curiously. Stepping aside, he pulled Giles to his side. "God has sent us another good brother to share our labor and our joy." They greeted Giles joyfully. These men who were grateful to God for their vocation pleased him. In turn, God rewarded their good work by sending many more men to follow them. "We are men from Assisi, who live a life of penance." This was the answer the brothers gave to anyone who inquired. Just as Jesus had sent the apostles, they also went forth 2 by 2 into the surrounding villages and towns preaching the gospel. Some people received them well, others did not. But nothing discouraged Francis, nor his brothers, who had taken on his optimistic spirit. Their aim was to love Christ and to make him loved. Everything else had taken second place. More disciples came. Sabatino, Morico, and John were their names. Before leaving on their missionary journeys, Francis would call them to speak a few words of encouragement, almost always repeating the words of the gospel. "Be patient and humble. Preach the good news of Christ to all. Stay there for a time, accept whatever is given you," and he would conclude, "My brothers, rejoice, for your names are written in heaven. Rejoice, for my brothers' names are written in heaven." Francis and his brothers were in every sense apostles. An apostle is first a man of prayer. Thus, from the grace received from God in prayer, he becomes a man of action. They realized that one cannot give what he does not have. Hence, the brothers could only do as much good as they were holy. Their theology was right, because God sent many new vocations: brothers Philip, John, Barbarus, Bernard of Vigilanejo, and Angelo. Now they were 12, as the apostles of Christ. The community grew, but the hut they called home shrunk. A shed at Rivo toward a twisted river became the new monastery. It really wasn't too much of an improvement, for it just accommodated the 12 brothers. Father Francis marked off each room with a chalk line, and on the 12 beams supporting the shed, he wrote the names of each of the brothers to designate their quarters. The newly born Franciscan family could be found wherever help was needed, working in hospitals, serving the lepers, living the life of God's poor. They were paid with the bread they ate, but when the bread was scarce, the roots of herbs and grass proved to be a good substitute. At night, the sounds of heave and lay chanting emanated from the humble shed, reaching the village and the hearts of all who heard. Francis began to realize that a religious congregation was forming around him, and he, who was so devoted to the church, did not want to go one step further without first obtaining the blessing of the Pope. "We will all make a pilgrimage to Rome," he decided. "There we will pray at the tombs of Peter and Paul, the first apostles, and ask the Holy Father's permission to preach and continue our life of prayer and penance." With their sights set on the eternal city, Rome, the brothers left Rivo Tordo, alternating the hours of the long journey with prayers, hymns, and happy recreation. The year Francis was 28 years old. A small band of men, dressed in shabby brown tunics, approached the eternal city. People stopped on the streets, looking with a mixture of shock and wonder at this unusual group. The brothers, accustomed to every kind of reaction from the people on their missions, proceeded peacefully. After a visit to the tombs of the Holy Apostles, Francis led the brothers to Bishop Guido from Assisi, who was then in Rome. The bishop arranged a meeting for them with Cardinal John of St. Paul, who could make a visit to the Holy Father possible. The reaction of the cardinal matched that of the Roman people, who were not exactly sure what to make of the barefoot crew, who seemed more like beggars than brothers of the church. "Come back tomorrow," said the bewildered bishop. He needed time to see what this new community was up to. It was easy to understand the prelate's cautious behavior, for these were troubled times. At times, the people resented authority, even papal authority. Perhaps it was because the church, whose duty it was to help men win heaven, had to remind them now and then of their obligations toward God. Even some of the clergy were caught up in worldly affairs, and the faith of their flock suffered. Cardinal John drummed his fingers on his desk. "How does the little man from Assisi fit into all this?" he mumbled to himself. But Bishop Guido, the cardinal's tone changed from pleading to sarcasm. "Absolute poverty in the preaching apostolate too? The man is crazy. Monks embrace poverty and clerics preach. One man cannot do both. If they are going to preach, they will need material support and ... Bishop Guido interrupted. "Yes, I know, but assure you that his way of life will work. He is above all sincere and loyal to the church and to the Holy Father. He wants to lead the world to God. Talk to him, see for yourself." When Francis and his brothers returned, Cardinal John questioned them. "Poverty and preaching? It's too idealistic. How do you plan to keep going?" "Idealistic or not," Francis answered, "I know that the life we seek is written in the gospel. If the apostles could do it, God will give us this same grace, will he not? Already he has sent more brothers." The cardinal fell silent as he listened to the young man's courage and devotion. Finally he spoke. "God bless you, my son. I will do what I can. I will arrange a meeting with His Holiness." Francis and his brothers returned to the tombs of the apostles to pray and wait. The next day, the brothers came to the appointed place. They waited, and time never passed so slowly. Finally, a door opened. "His Holiness will see you now," a priest announced. The brothers quickly proceeded in an orderly fashion, with Francis at the head, through the large door and into the great hall. When Francis saw the Pope only a short distance ahead, his feet came to a sudden stop. The fact that they were actually there struck him with acute awareness. "Come," the smile. "What is it?" Holy Father said with a "You seek from us." Pope Innocent III listened carefully while Francis explained his spiritual and apostolic plan of life. The Pope rubbed his Pope Innocent's eye. I listened carefully, while Francis explained his spiritual and apostolic plan of life. Chin, while he sat deep in thought, he said nothing for a long time. Finally he spoke. "My son, I am afraid that your life is too severe. I am convinced of your good will and strong spirit. But what about those who will come later? Francis fixed his gaze on the large, wooden crucifix that hung from the wall and responded humbly, respectfully. I depend on my Lord Christ. He, the creator of heaven and earth, will give us what we need. He himself has said, "Seek first the kingdom of heaven, and all else will be given you besides." A fatherly smile lit the pontiff's face. Yes, my son, but he also said, the spirit is eager, but the flesh weak. Pray, therefore, to see how far God wants you to follow in. This way, the meeting was over. Francis and his brothers did pray. The papal days were filled to the brim with all the usual affairs of the Vatican. One day the priest aide to the Pope noticed that the Holy Father did not look well. "Your Holiness, may I help you in any way?" the priest asked. "No, no, Father," the Pope replied with a slight smile. "I am just tired. I was awake half of the night. I kept having the same dream over and over, and each time it woke me from sleep." "Oh," the priest asked. The Pope's eyes assumed a far-off look, and his face became troubled as he relived the dream. "I could see a church shaking. Some bricks began to fall. I saw myself lamenting the problems of heresy, and I wept at the true bled faces of the scattered sheep of the flock." The Pope stopped and put his head in his hands. "Then what?" the priest insisted gently. Then, just when the whole church was ready to crumble, a small man came up to it, making the sign of the cross and putting his shoulder to the front of the building. He kept it from falling. "Well, it was a nice ending," the priest encouraged. The Pope, seemingly lost in thought, murmured softly, "That face, I've seen that face, but where?" Then, coming back from his puzzled-ed thoughts, he asked, "How many more audiences are scheduled?" "Just one, Your Holiness, the man from Assisi, who, you remember Brother Francis and his followers." "Oh yes, I vaguely remember." "All right, show them in." When Francis and the brothers walked into the hall, Pope Innocent stood up in surprise. "Something wrong?" the priest asked. The little man, "Pardon me," the bewildered priest swore. "That's the man," the Pope continued. "Yes, the one from Assisi," the confused aide repeated. "Francis is the man in my dream who kept the church from falling." "No, he is the man in my dream who kept the church from falling." He didn't wait for the brothers to approach him, but walked briskly across the great hall and met them halfway. Not for a minute did Pope Innocent take his eyes off the serene face of the young man who led the group. "Your Holiness," Francis began humbly, "God has given me these brothers to follow the way of penance and prayer revealed to us in the Gospel. Will God, who has so blessed our family, refuse to give us what we need spiritually and materially?" The Pope's eyes filled with tears as the thought flooded his mind, "This man is a true restorer of the church." The Holy Father was right. Francis and his brothers would do a great work of restoration through prayer, penance, and apostolic work. The example of their own lives would prove to be a most effective means of reform. The Holy Father embraced Francis, saying, "Go, my son, with your good brothers. God be with you. Preach the gospel and continue your life of poverty. When God will bless you with more brothers, return, and we will help you continue along the paths God will trace for you. You have our permission and our blessing. ... Preach the gospel and continue your life of poverty. And you have our permission, our blessing." The brothers were left homeless when a farmer claimed the little shack at Rivo Torto as his own property. Francis, with his characteristic optimism, encouraged them. "How good God is. Our little house was too small, so he took it away. Now he, our good Father, will provide something else." And he was right. The Benedictines offered them a bigger home near St. Mary's Chapel, which the brothers gladly accepted. Francis insisted on giving the monks a basket of fish a year to pay the rent. This way, the brothers would not own any property and would have to depend solely on God to provide. These were beautiful times for Francis, golden days, when he and the brothers could follow closely the path traced in the gospel. More men continued to come, brothers Rufino, Maceo, Juniper, and Leo, all eager to follow Christ in the good spirit of Francis. And Francis was a good father to his spiritual sons. One night, the community was startled out of slumber by unearthly howls. "I'm sick. I'm dying." Francis bounded from his cot. A lone candle furnished enough light for him to see who was wailing. It turned out to be one of the newer brothers, who was sitting on his bed repeating over and over, "I'm dying." "What is wrong?" Brother Francis questioned anxiously as he placed his hand on the young man's head. "What are you dying of?" "Hunger," was the shouted reply. Father Francis, turning his head slightly to hide a smile, motioned the distraught friar to follow him and said, "Come, brother, let us go and eat." All of the brothers, roused out of sleep by the commotion, joined Francis and the hungry brother in a midnight snack. The brothers not only shared the meal, but the laughter as well. Father Francis ended the event with well-chosen words of advice. "Brothers, God has given to each of us different abilities. To the one with 10 talents, he expects 10 in return, but he does not expect 10 from one who has only 5. Do your best and be in peace. God will take care of the rest." On another occasion, when some of the brothers became discouraged, Francis picked up 2 sticks from the ground and pretended to play the fiddle. He sang and danced until the brothers were howling with laughter at his silly little show. He laughed right along with them and told them, "The moral of this story, good friars, is this: there is never a reason for discouragement. Only if we have committed a sin should we wear a long face. There is no difficulty that cannot be overcome by prayer, obedience, and the spirit of joy." When Francis of Assisi was not praying, he was preaching. The language he used was deliberately simple, so that even the most uneducated person had no difficulty understanding his message. When Francis went to a church to preach, he usually carried, of all things, a broom. Before beginning his sermon, he would give each church an energetic sweep. "The house of God must be kept neat and clean," he would explain, "for it is Christ who dwells here, and he deserves no neglect." A time came when people began to wonder if perhaps Francis of Assisi was a saint. The spirit he lived spread rapidly and far, and the day was near when Francis would have to prepare a Franciscan way of life for the many lay people who sought it. They would become the third order. Women, too, wanted to follow this religious life. Many felt that Francis had found the way. Claire Offerduccio, a girl from one of Assisi's wealthiest families, was the first to follow Francis. Her sister, Agnes, joined shortly after. The core group of Franciscan women lived in a poor little convent and followed the rule that Francis had written. This new religious family became the second order of saint. Francis called the poor Clares. The core group of Franciscan women lived in a poor little convent and followed the rule that Francis had written. Everyone below deck. The captain's shouts were barely audible above the raging winds and high seas, which were threatening to wash everything overboard. "Bring down the sails." The captain motioned to one of the sailors. "Go below and see to those 2 brothers. They're not used to the sea, let alone a squall like this." Aye, Captain," replied the mate as he started down the narrow hatch. "And tell them they had better pray the driving rain could not hide the worried expression on the captain's face." The musty hall was lit by one flickering candle. A door to the brothers' cabin banged back and forth as the ship rocked with the waves. "Hello there," the sailor called. "Brother Francis." "Brother, are you all right down there?" The cabin door stopped its rattling as a small figure grabbed it for balance. "Yes, Sir," Francis answered. "Can we be of any help?" The captain said to pray, "It's pretty bad up here." The brothers' reply was drowned out by a loud splash of water against the hull, which jolted them all to the floor. As he tried to regain his footing on the heaving deck, The sailor yelled, "Just keep praying, brothers." And pray they did. The storm continued throughout the day. Night fell and their situation grew worse. Water was seeping through the beams of the ship. Later that night, there was a resounding crash and the ship came to a sudden halt. The captain's piercing whistle could be heard from the top deck. That meant trouble. When the brothers heard the cracking of timbers and the rushing of water, they knew it was bad trouble. Francis and his companion hurried to the top deck as fast as the tilting ship would allow. The ship was lodged on a gigantic rock, but they knew that their prayers had been answered because there, only a few hundred feet in the distance, was land. So ended their journey to bring their mission to Syria. Brother Francis and his friar companion found themselves in Slavonia with no food, no money, and no way to communicate their situation. The brothers spoke no Syrian, the Syrians spoke no Italian. But Francis was always ready to pray and God seemed always ready to answer. They found a sailor in the city who agreed to smuggle them on board another ship bound for Italy. The brothers were stowed away in a small area behind the barrels in the storage room, which was far from comfortable. They had managed to obtain just enough bread for themselves for the voyage. Everything seemed to work out fine until one night they heard a familiar sound: high wind, drenching rain, and howling seas. The younger brother turned a little green as he looked over at Francis. "Oh, no," he gulped. "Is it possible?" Francis pretended not to understand and answered calmly, "Oh, everything is possible with God. Have faith." "I'm sorry, Father Francis. I know that God rescued us once and he will do it again." A short time later, their faith was tested when some of the crew discovered the stow. A ways, look, here, extra, ka, argo, and we are miles off course. Our ration won't last and we'll all starve. Let's throw them over the side. It will be too less to feed another crewman, snarled. Double dose. Francis' tone was calm. "Brother sailors, God is our good Father. He will give us our daily bread. Just ask him. Look, here are a couple loaves of bread we brought for the voyage. We'll share it with you." The sailors laughed at the prospect of a few loaves of bread for so many men, but they were moved by the generosity of the brothers and decided to let them remain. The voyage continued safely. And God did provide, for that little bit of bread never ran out. The voyage caused the unsuccessful missionary serious doubts. Was this God's way of telling Francis that he should become a monk and spend the rest of his life in the silence of a cloister? He sent Brother Maceo to ask the thought of Sister Claire and Brother Sylvester, the first priest who had followed Francis. When Brother Maceo returned, Francis immediately questioned, "Brother, what does God want from me, Father Francis?" Both Brother Sylvester and Sister Claire gave me the same answer: "God has not called you for yourself only, but for others too. Continue to preach." "Well then, Brother Maceo, let us preach," came the spontaneous reply. Taking Brothers Maceo and Angelo along, he started off down the road. "Wait for me here," motioned Francis. The two friars watched in wonder as their master approached the forest along the side of the road. His small stature seemed even more dwarfed by the towering trees. Then, raising his arms as if to embrace the forest, he called out, "My sister birds, be grateful to God and praise Him." Hundreds of birds, forming a dazzling array of color, flew from the branches and flocked around the simple creature that called them. They perched on his shoulders, his forearms, the palms of his hands, and even on the cowl of his shabby brown habit. Strangely, the little birds remained silent and still. Francis continued, "Be grateful, sister birds, for you neither sow nor reap, but God feeds you. See how freely you fly, how sweetly you sing. How beautiful are your coats of color. Your Creator has given you these. Praise Him. Be grateful for the high trees to build your nests. Love the good Lord, and always be grateful for His gifts to you." The birds fluttered their wings as though to signify approval. They seemed to understand every word he had said. Francis saw the hand of God the Creator in everything, and the great love he bore for his Heavenly Father overflowed to all God's creatures. He saw everyone and everything as a part of the magnificent family of God. Thus, Francis could truly call all creatures brother or sister. A story is told about the neighboring town of Gubbio, where a group of anxious citizens summoned Francis and asked for his help when a wolf was ravaging the village. The wild animal was destroying flocks and endangering the lives of the people. Not even the bravest farm hand dared to approach the wolf. The small, barefooted friar walked up to the edge of the woods alone. Worried faces peered out of windows, excited hearts beat percent. "Brother Wolf, come here." The large, gray animal slunk toward the lonely figure, hard and fast. Suddenly, Francis stopped. Calmly, firmly, he called, "Brother Wolf, come here." The large, gray animal slunk toward the lonely figure. "Brother Wolf," Francis scolded, "I have heard many complaints about you, killing the village flocks and frightening everyone. God made enough for all to share. There is no reason for you to take what God has provided for others." The wolf bent his head. "From now on, you are to go from door to door. I promise you that if you do as I say, these people will feed you peacefully from then on." The wolf began to appear, canvassing the homes for his supper, and the town of Gubbio found peace. Sharp winds twisted the layers of snow into circle-like designs, and a glistening array of stars transformed the naked sky. There was something special about this night. It was Christmas Eve. All was peaceful. Candles in village homes cast dancing reflections on the snow outside. High on the mountain, there shone a lone light. Francis and his brothers were assisting at the Christmas midnight mass. The scene was a cave lent for the occasion by a wealthy landowner, John Valletta. Signor Valletta was also present. Francis had picked the spot carefully. The cave was so like the one Joseph had chosen some 1,200 years before. Earlier on that day, the brothers had arranged to have an ox, a donkey, and some hay placed under the small, homemade altar. Why did he go to all this trouble? There was something special about this night. "I want to see with my own eyes the poverty in which Christ the King was born," Francis replied in his quiet way. Those present held lighted torches in honor of the Christ child. The Massachusetts began. Then something strange and wonderful happened. Signor Valletta stared in disbelief, then glanced at the others to see if they too had seen it. The expression on their faces told him that they did see. There, on the hay beneath that makeshift altar, the baby lived and breathed. As the crowd knelt in stunned silence, the frail brother walked the few steps to the front of the chapel, and kneeling reverently, he whispered, "Are you really there? Is it really you?" Francis smiled tenderly at the tiny, motionless infant. The infant smiled back. No doubt remained in his heart. It was the Christ child. He picked up the child and held him in his arms, his whole being seeming to glow. Suddenly, the infant smiled and, raising his tiny hand, stroked the friar's beard. There were years of consolation, but there were years of sorrow too. Only a few years had elapsed since 5 of Francis' brothers had been martyred for their preaching in Morocco. Other missionaries who had followed in their footsteps had found unwilling, "Are you really there? Is it really you?" Francis picked up the Christ child and held him in his arms. Listeners also. Even Francis himself, arriving in Egypt to preach to the Muslims, found it impossible to remain long. Recalling those happy days when he had preached to a listening throng, to Sister Bird and Brother Wolf, and perceiving his bitter failure now, he wept. He returned to Italy, broken in health and suffering from a painful eye lesion. The bitter years were now beginning. The man who had followed the Master's public life as closely as any mere man could ever do would now follow him to Calvary. Bare feet kicked up the dust from the sun-scorched earth. Francis and 5 brothers were going to celebrate the feast of the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin at La Verna, a mountain not too far from Assisi. On arriving, they sat down a short time to rest, and Francis took the opportunity to say a few words to them. "My dear sons, be faithful. Keep the spirit of holy poverty shown us by the gospel." He looked at each brother, eye to eye. These 5, this core group, were the most loyal to the gospel way of life. "Brothers," Francis said earnestly, "be faithful. No one asked what he was thinking, they knew. As had happened to many holy founders of other religious congregations, Francis was disheartened by a few in his order who thought they knew better than the man who had taught them. They did not want to abandon this vocation, of course, but they only wanted to soften it a bit, and this would ruin everything. A few days later, after much prayer and thought, Francis called Brother Leo to come to him. "Read a passage of the Gospel for me. This book has all the answers." Brother Leo opened the book at random and read ... He was the description of the past Scion of Christ. Twice more the brother opened the Gospel, and twice more it was on the Passion. Brother Leo Francis said, "Let me be in peace. I resign myself to suffer, for this is the will of God. My death is near. I will go to live across the stream and remain alone with God. You will bring me bread and water each day, but before you cross the bridge, call out to me with the first prayer of the divine office. Only if I answer, may you come over." One night, Brother Leo stopped as usual on the bridge and called loudly the prayer, "O Lord, you will open my mouth." No sound could be heard except the water running beneath the bridge. The friar shouted louder, "O Lord, you will open my mouth." ... Utter silence. For a month, the Holy Founder continued his silent retreat, fasting on bread and water. What could was worried? I be wrong, Brother Leo. Hope Father Francis is all right. How he was tempted to cross that bridge, but he remembered his founder's request. Finally, worry and fear got the best of him, and he hesitated only slightly as he crossed the bridge. As he came to the other side, he could hear a muffled voice coming from the direction of the hut. He hid in the shadow of a tree, searching the area near the hut. Suddenly, he came upon the figure of Francis lying prostrate on the ground with arms outstretched. The friar was whispering, "Quanisht imcamonia. Oh God, who are you? And who am I but your worthless creature?" As the eavesdropper peered around the tree, he accidentally snapped off a dead branch. Brother Leo's heart beat so loudly that it seemed to pop in his ears. "Who's there?" Francis cried. In his excitement, Brother Leo stuttered as he replied, It's me, Brother Leo." "Brother Leo, what are you doing? Tell me now, what did you hear?" Francis asked. The nervous brother mumbled out the prayer he had overheard. "Tell me what you meant, Father Francis," he continued. "Oh, little Lamb of God, my brother, in the prayer you heard I understood two lights, who God is ... and then who I am. How could such a great God bother with the likes of me? How good is God? Now I have explained the prayer to you, so go in peace." As Brother Leo backed away somewhat relieved, he heard Francis call out to him, "But make sure not to spy on me again." On the feast of the Exaltation of the Holy Cross, September 14th, Brother Leo once again called over the bridge and once again heard no response to his prayer. This time, Francis would not hear anything, for he was totally absorbed in prayer and contemplation of the Passion of Christ. His profound meditation lasted all that night. "Lord Jesus," he prayed, "give me your pain. Give me your love." As he prayed, a radiant figure holding a crucifix appeared and spoke to the forlorn friar who lay on the damp and clammy ground. "You will not die a martyr's death as some of your sons have. You will be transformed instead into the living image of Christ crucified." What did it all mean? Francis knew. Suddenly, deep bleeding wounds began to form on his hands, feet, and side. "Iron nails, Lord Jesus, give me your pain. Give me your love," became visible in his hands and feet. The pains of his master seared his body until it became a living replica of the dying Christ. But the physical pain could not destroy the great joy and serene peace he felt. Somehow there had been an exchange. In truth, Francis had exchanged the intangible sorrows he bore in his heart for the physical sufferings of Christ. The humble friar said nothing of the stigmata, But it did not remain a secret for long. As Brother Leo washed the friar's habit, he found the sleeves, the hem and the sides stained with blood, and he realized immediately what had happened. At the end of September, Francis left Laverna. A borrowed donkey carried him slowly down the mountain. As he rode along, his gaze fixed upon Laverna. In his heart, he felt that this would be the last time he would ever see its beautiful green shrubs or hear the rippling creek or the singing of sister birds, and he was right. News of his stigmata moved much more swiftly than the donkey that carried the little man. Throngs of people lined the streets to catch a glimpse of him as he traveled to Assisi. Francis was returning to Our Lady's chapel to die. Lining the route were many of the same faces who had greeted him as he returned. Career, who as children had laughed at the crazy. Man, when he had returned as a beggar after his first fasts in the mountains, now called Hail, Saint, our Saint. Francis blessed them and went quietly into retreat with his brothers. Praises from the great throngs did not impress him, just as the insults cast upon him years ago had not disturbed him either. Blessed is that servant, he had once explained to his brothers, who does not look upon himself as better when he is praised and exalted by men than when he is reckoned vile, simple and contemptible for whatever a man is before God, that he is indeed and nothing more. A month ... Maybe this was the answer Francis received when he asked a doctor how long he would remain on this earth. Brother Elias, who was acting in place of Francis as superior general, had finally convinced him to have his eyes treated, but it was too late. Francis was physically consumed. Francis remained in Assisi where he wished to die. Every day Francis' canticle of the sun could be heard around the chapel. Most high, omnipotent, good Lord, yours are the praises, the glory, the honor, and all benediction. To you alone, most high, do they belong, and no man is worthy to mention you. Praised be you, my Lord, with all your creatures, especially the honored brother sun, who makes the day and illumines us through you, and he is beautiful and radiant with great splendor. Bears the sign of you, most high one. Praised be you, my Lord, for sister moon, and the stars. You have formed them in heaven clear and precious and beautiful. Praised be you, my Lord, for brother wind, and for the air and cloudy and clear and every weather. Praised be you, my Lord, for sister water, which is very useful and humble and precious and chaste. Praised be you, my Lord, for brother fire, by whom you light the night. And he is beautiful and jocund and robust and strong. Praised be you, my Lord, for our sister mother earth, who sustains and governs us, and produces various fruits with colored flowers and herbage. Praise and bless my Lord and give him thanks, and serve him with great humility. Very soon there was added a new verse. Praised be you, O Lord, for our sister bodily death, from whom no living man can escape. Woe to those who die in mortal sin. Blessed are those who have discovered your most holy will, for to them the second death can do no harm. Although the poor man from Assisi had no material wealth to leave his spiritual sons, he wrote a last will and testament, bequeathing the most precious gift he could give to them, the Franciscan spirit. He prayed that each of his members would choose Lady Poverty as their spouse, totally and for a lifetime, for this lady was the love of Francis' heart, she, who knew no compromise, she, who had led him to desire to be as poor as Christ. On Thursday, October 1st, 1226, the friar lay dying in the clay hut behind the chapel. Bones protruded from the worn body. The pale, drawn lips smiled at the brothers, his dearest sons. The deep, sunken eyes squinted for a glimpse of each of them. I bless you here, and those to come, he murmured, straining to be heard. I bless you as much as I can, and more than I can. The brothers prayed and waited. Heaven and earth were fighting for that soul. Heaven was calling it, but earth wanted to hold it back for a while. Friday, he awoke in great pain. Read the scriptures to me, he whispered. One of the brothers took the gospel in his hands, his voice shaking as he read. It was the passage of Christ washing the feet of his disciples. How appropriate it seemed now. Brother Angelo and Brother Leo sang almost continuously the Canticle of the Son at the request of Francis, who would invariably join in on the last verse, "Praise be you, O Lord, for our sister bodily death." Saturday, Francis was laid on the chapel floor without his habit at his own request. This shocking way to spend his last hours was understood by those who saw in this last action a kind of final tribute to his Lady Poverty. His mother, Lady Pica, would have understood. She would have seen in her son's stark poverty a prophetic fulfillment of his birth in a stable. Even his father, Pietro, before he died, had come to realize that in the humility of religious poverty, his son had become truly great. He understood that Francis' uncompromising imitation of the life of Christ had led him to become poor of spirit, completely detached from this world, and thus worthy of the pearl of great price, the promise of the Beatitude. Now his was the kingdom of heaven. The light of day faded, evening fell quietly. In the darkened, hallowed chapel, one could hear Francis' heavy breathing. In a rasping voice, he intoned psalm that concludes, "Lead me forth from prison, that I may give thanks to your name. The just shall gather around me, when you have been good to me." Those about him prayed. Christ arrived in the hallowed room. Silence. The last word of Francis' life was spoken by Jesus Christ. "Good and faithful servant, enter into the joy of your master."